Easy guys, welcome back to the lab. Today's experiment begins with a terrible idea. I'll be recreating and attempting to thrive as a dragon in the world's most advanced evolution sim, Spore. A cutting-edge simulation if you ignore most of the evidence. Of course, our dragon was a carnivore. And like all creatures in Spore, my journey begins in the cell stage on the planet Draconis. At this point, our dragon was not very dragon-like at all. In fact, he was underwater, the complete antithesis of our fiery ambitions. Slowly chewing on what I can only describe as damp meatballs, the discarded remnants of some other, less fortunate biological experiment. We were slow, we were ponderous, and despite our long-term plans involving fire and dominance, our immediate concerns were mostly chewing. It wasn't long, however, before our dragon set his sights on more ambitious prey, living creatures. This proved difficult. We were slow and ponderous, and attempting to chase smaller, faster organisms turned out to be an inefficient survival strategy. As we grew, it became increasingly obvious that evolution was no longer optional. Our opportunity came when we hunted down a slow, spiked creature, which generously donated its spines as an evolutionary upgrade. I enlarged our mouth to make feeding easier, and added spikes at the front to pierce and maim any prey we managed to keep up with, which wasn't much. The spines were effective at disabling prey, but they did little to solve our more fundamental issue: speed. To address this, I began keeping an eye out for any speed-enhancing upgrades, because while injuring prey is helpful, actually reaching it turned out to be the hardest part. And for reasons that remain unclear, eating was still far more difficult than expected. Between competing predators and our own inability to move. Pew! Get out of here. I finally earned my jet. Thank you, Darwin. We began seeking a compatible organism for reasons strictly related to science. I changed our color to a deep, draconian red. It's definitely not pink, and his backside evolved into a powerful jet. After eons of chasing prey without ever quite reaching it, our dragon developed an intense, unyielding stare. One that suggested focus, determination, and possibly unresolved anger issues. We were now fast. Not as fast as that guy, but fast. Our dragon grew cocky. He began attacking larger, more dangerous predators. We attempted to flank one and spike its exposed side. This hypothesis collapsed immediately. We fled. It turned out we weren't the only creatures in the tide pool equipped with spikes. The game we were playing had become significantly more dangerous. As our dragon fought to survive, it became clear that we did not always make the wisest decisions. This particular one ended in poison. It wasn't long before our next evolutionary upgrades arrived: cilia and poison. We grew cilia like great dragon wings, dramatically increasing our speed to 5, and began soaring through the tide pool. Our poison sacs mounted at the tail left a visible trail in our wake. While hunting, we encountered electric creatures. Our secret was patience. Like all charged predators, they were most vulnerable when their charge was empty. We attacked during their cooldown period, an easy meal for our dragon. And eventually, we ascended the tide pool as a fully carnivorous creature. We continued evolving. Our body grew longer. Our neck also grew back. Not that far. We developed a proud dragon chest. Definitely not a seahorse, a dragon. We grew our 4 limbs, retained our cilia, now functioning as evolutionary baggage, and added a proud, purposeful tail. Wait, that's not a tail. That's better. Like one of those Spitz dogs. With our anatomy now technically complete, our dragon was ready to ascend to land. He roared. Good effort, we'll work on that. And with that, our mighty dragon beckoned his kind towards the shore. After setting up the dragon nest, it was time to introduce ourselves to the locals. The first creature we encountered was the Robo-Harimo, small, cute, lunch. This assessment was followed by a brief and somewhat disturbing feeding process, involving impalement and a level of enthusiasm I wasn't prepared for. There were many pretty things on the shore, but constrained by our medieval design principles, our dragon was denied hands, which meant interaction consisted mostly of aggressive nudging, followed by immediate disengagement. Nature called us back to the editor. Our posture evolved. The rear joint shifted backwards, giving us a more forward-leaning stance. One arm began functioning asymmetrically, less like a limb, more like a tail. Our front legs moved forward. To support this, we added a long snout for eating on land and proper weaponry to the tail. The red-scaled texture worked well enough for now, as we edged closer to our finished dragon form. But the experiment wasn't complete. There were still more parts to collect. We continued preying on smaller creatures, and in time our dragon's brain grew slightly larger. As the creature became marginally wiser, we returned to the nest to expand our numbers. 2 dragons working together, a flock of dragons, or a clutch, or a flight, a scourge of dragons. I'm still unclear actually on the correct collective noun, so feel free to submit your findings in the comments. Our dragon chose to take this young hatchling under his wing, not out of affection, he had no idea whose child this was, but for the good of the species. The hatchling was learning. It quickly became apparent that speed was still a problem. Our dragons remained slow and lumbering when pursuing prey. So once again evolution beckoned, a more devastating bite. New feet for increased speed, and finally, actual wings. The hunt continued until once again our dragon's brain grew. And just like the last time, we returned to the nest to expand the group. Another dragon was added, and through further evolution we became faster once more. This did not go entirely to plan. An encounter with the Sing-Tu left us with 1 dragon down, with the rest barely escaping alive. Retreat was the only option. Sacrificing the group while we ran turned out to be the most effective survival strategy. Tactical withdrawal initiated. We returned to the nest to replace the lost dragon before heading back out, not to learn, but to settle the matter. Meteorites began falling across our primordial world, and in the chaos the dragons found opportunity. The remaining Sing-Tu, already weakened, did not survive the panic. Once more our dragon's brain grew, signaling another return to the nest for evolution. A sharper bite, courtesy of a larger mouth. New eyes, better feet for increased speed, and a deadlier slashing weapon mounted to the tail. While rogue creatures preyed on stragglers across the land, our dragon focused on opportunity. Attacking groups head-on was still dangerous, even with 4 dragons, so we hunted the fleeing, the distracted, and the unlucky. We also began using the planet's volcanic spice vents, launching our creature high into the air and soaring faster than our wings alone would allow. From nest to nest we gathered parts as we went, refining the design, all in preparation for our dragon's final form. We returned to the nest once more to evolve. At this point, the Dark Injection mod gave us access to even more parts, including a much more draconic mouth. The wide, square jaw was a little too much for my taste, but it was workable. We were still missing a significant number of parts, and this is where Spore's expansions, combined with various mods, reveal their true cost. The more parts you add to your catalog, the longer you're required to remain in the creature stage hunting and collecting everything manually. And so that's exactly what we did. It was time for our dragons to migrate to another nest. Along the way, they encountered scattered bones, an opportunity to collect more parts, and fighting whatever defended them. We took losses, we replenished, we continued. The problem was scale. To complete the build, we needed to kill a lot of creatures. And so the legacy of the dragon was born. Mighty beasts said to terrorize the landscape were in reality just methodically collecting every evolutionary part available. Part snake, part lizard. The only viable strategy was total acquisition. We had to catch them all. After leaving a considerable trail of destruction behind us, we finally reached the last migration site of our dragon kind, before immediately moving on to terrorize all our nearest neighbors. Little by little, our posture continued to evolve. We grew spiked horns at the back of the head, a common thread in dragon design, and began working toward a heavier brow above the eyes. I didn't yet have the parts I wanted, so for now, small tooth-shaped bones would have to do, which meant killing more creatures. And so the dragon's legacy as a killing machine continued to etch itself into the landscape. I returned to the nest to replenish our fallen comrades. The nest was empty. This often left me summoning a mate, politely rejecting them, and then inviting them into the group instead. An efficient, if emotionally questionable way to acquire a new party member. We returned to the hunt. More parts were needed. We began attacking from the sky, soaring down on our victims. I briefly experimented with giving the dragons hands, but this betrayed the medieval Western dragon formula. So the evolutionary experiment was short-lived. Handicapped by medieval fashion, we moved on. As more parts unlocked, the dragon design began to take shape. We added a fin down the spine, echoing the dragons of Game of Thrones. I experimented with eyes and shifted away from the bright red scales towards a more neutral grey, accented with red highlights. Unfortunately, those highlights eroded the iris colour, forcing me to lighten the rest of the body highlights to a bright yellow to compensate. The feet were returned to the front legs, and serpent-like side fins were added to the head, giving it a more cobra-like, reptilian presence. Satisfied, briefly, I returned to the world. There were still more parts to collect. Evolution continued. New, more muscular legs refined the proportions, making the body leaner and more snake-like. The teeth on this dragon mouth were quite dark and illegible, so I added an extra layer for aggression. I also began building a stronger brow line, using parts from the Creepy and Cute parts pack. Some of the eye parts began clipping into the model, which I planned to fix shortly. At which point I remembered that in Spore the bottom teeth are actually attached to the top of the mouth, despite appearances. So the artificial teeth were removed and fangs were added to the upper jaw instead. To resolve the eye clipping, I switched to the newer Dark Spore creature parts, which allowed finer control over eye depth in the socket. From there, I added further detail to the neck, chest and spine. At this point, we had pushed far beyond the complexity limits of unmodded Spore. In the editor, with a single dragon and a simple background, everything looked fantastic. In-game, however, the hard-coded limits of a 15-year-old game engine began to surface. We had blown the shader budgets. Our dragon began rendering as an intermittent purple mask, and so we returned to the editor once more, removing creature complexity until the engine was sufficiently appeased. Where the fuck did that come from? This wasn't the only issue I had to deal with. I still didn't really have an answer for the wings. Spore's default wing parts were functional and properly animated, but they were often far too small for what I had in mind. I considered building fake limbs and attaching wings to those instead, but in the end I chose to stick with the standard wings, even if they made the dragon look slightly cartoonish. At this point I was already scraping the absolute limits of creature complexity. By the time I arrived at the finished design, I knew I was operating right at the edge of what the engine could reliably render. It was possible to reduce the game's lighting quality to compensate, but I wasn't quite ready to return to the year 1999 for graphical fidelity. Eventually, after a lot of going back and forth, our dragons were ready to advance to the tribal stage. The tribal stage introduced a new complication. Our dragons did not have arms, which meant that, technologically speaking, the only way they could make fire was by aggressively face-smashing piles of sticks together. Lacking arms, our dragons also lacked any practical way to carry a torch, which, historically speaking, explains a lot about the fire breathing. This technique was later repurposed for building tools, housing, and most social interactions. Due to our ongoing struggle with creature complexity limits, armor was also ruled out entirely. Any additional detail risked further graphical instability. So the hypothesis was simple. Could a tribe of unarmored, face-smashing dragons survive purely on technique? Our long necks allowed us to fish, making this our first controlled food source. Unfortunately, the fishing spot was directly above the Magenta tribe's village. Luckily for us, as with most early tribal competitors in Spore, they were neutral, curious, and surprisingly tolerant of dragons fishing beneath their homes. We briefly considered destroying them. Instead, we tested diplomacy, and so they were returned to our side, not out of mercy, but because tolerating them produced better results than destroying them. This proved surprisingly effective. The Magenta began offering regular gifts, protection, and occasional food baskets. They were promoted to vassals. As fishing efficiency improved, aided by our newly developed spears, the Cyan tribe launched an attack. Using face-smashing, hatchets, and Magenta assistance, the threat was soon neutralized. During this conflict, the Green tribe attempted stealing food from our stores. Unwilling to get dragged all the way to their village, we let them escape. The Lavender tribe tried the same tactic, but we were now prepared for such antics and caught them immediately. Somewhere along the way, dragons stopped being predators and started being considered a pantry. Despite the theft, the Magenta continued supplying gifts, which largely offset the loss. This only seemed to aggravate the situation. After the Lavenders had been caught stealing and discovering it hadn't even worked, made them even more annoyed. The Lavenders responded by launching a full invasion. which our dragons successfully repelled. A standing defense force of 3 face smashers armed with hatchets was established. The rest continued fishing. To diversify nutrition, our chieftain captured a local creature and began egg production. This was a mistake. Dragons queued at the altar. Dragons stood still and starved, staring into the abyss as though their stomachs would feed themselves. Eggs were unpopular. Confusingly, fish were also unpopular. Dragons died, and so replacement dragons were hatched to replace the dragons who refused to eat. Then the green tribe returned for another theft. This time we waited for them to try. Then we attacked. This escalated tensions with the greens. To counteract this, we recruited another vassal tribe, the cyans, to sit on the border with our enemies, the greens and the lavender. Meanwhile, continued gift-giving from the magenta and later the cyan tribe allowed us to repel further invasions, including further attacks from the greens. After the greens lost most of their population in a failed assault, we launched a counterattack. Hatchets advanced from the front, while other dragons launched spears from their faces. The green village was destroyed, the ecosystem simplified. The orange tribe appeared shortly after. Technologically advanced, we appeased them with a fruit basket while evaluating the lavenders. With food still unstable and dragons continuing to die for unclear dietary reasons, we decided to delete the lavender tribe entirely. This left only the orange tribe. As they posed no immediate threat, we absorbed them, using didgeridoos, flutes and maracas constructed entirely from our faces. Strange, but effective. The experiment concluded with a stable dragon society, achieved primarily through diplomacy, opportunism, and sustained ecological collapse.